In today's episode, one of the most gruesome shark attacks ever covered on this channel so far. An elderly man on vacation with his wife is ripped apart by a bull shark and eaten alive in front of everyone on the beach. Hit that like button and subscribe right now. This is the terrifying bull shark attack on Frederich Burgstaller. Welcome to Final Affliction. March 22, 2014 in South Africa dawned bright and warm. Summer had just winded down the month before, and even though it was technically already autumn, that year the heat hung around long enough for just a little while longer. The Austrian group of tourists that landed down had chosen this time specifically. Early autumn is still warm enough to enjoy the beaches, but not so blisteringly hot that their light European skin would suffer in the African sun. Right on the very tip of the country, bordering the Indian Ocean, lies the small holiday town of Port St. John's. The Indian Ocean is much warmer than the sometimes freezing Atlantic Ocean that lies on the other side of the country. And as you can imagine, it's along this coastline where most of the swimming, surfing, and snorkeling happens. The beaches are almost always packed unless it's in the dead of winter. And even then, there are always a handful of die-hard surfers still willing to go out into the waves. As popular a destination as Port St. John's is, it's not very well patrolled. The reality is that, of all of South Africa's nearly 3,000-mile coastline, every single inch of it is swarming with deadly sharks. Places like Jeffreys Bay, the Durban beaches, and Hartenbos are just busier and require the most attention. Port St. John's is not exactly on most tour groups' lists of hotspots. It's mostly frequented by locals, so it doesn't get as much traffic as the rest. You won't see any lifeguards here, and patrol vessels are at a minimum. Only the shark warning signs that dot the beach gives any indication that there might be any danger here. But in fact, it's one of the country's busiest breeding grounds for the colossal man-eating bull sharks. Had this group of Austrians, mostly made up of retirees, known this, maybe they'd have sought out another beach to cool off in. They only came to visit the iconic African safaris, the easy mountain trails, and they wanted to try out the local cuisine. But as soon as they landed, all of them decided that it was a good idea to find some water before heading inland to see the wild animals. Even along the coast, and in autumn no less, the heat was getting to them all. Frederich Burgstaller and his wife Margit practically threw themselves at the water when they arrived. The rest of the group were a little hesitant to get in themselves, not for fear of any danger. Instead, they found the packed beach a little claustrophobic. At 66, Frederich was still an excellent swimmer. He just needed to get past the first few shallow waves and he'd be out of the crowd, where he could stretch out his arms and swim in the ocean that was virtually empty after those first few yards. Margit was content to roll up her pant legs and wade in the surf up to her ankles and watch her husband weave through the dozens of youngsters and families who were having an absolute ball, splashing and playing. All of the feet treading through the water was kicking up so much sand that there was virtually no visibility. The water just looked mucky and brown from above. But even if someone had been sharp enough to see a hint of the gray body that was stalking the swimmers from below, the noise of the beach would have dampened any shouts of warning. The animal had been moving just out of reach, hoping to hone in on one person in particular. But the mass of moving limbs was confusing. Every time it decided on a target, the whole mass of people's patterns shifted, and it had to start hunting all over again. That's until Frederich stepped into the water. Just as he got in up to his waist, he turned around to wave at Margit. Those few seconds he spent to stand still was enough for the shark to focus on him, and his stark white skin didn't help the situation much. Among the bodies and the shades of brown and black around him, Frederich stood out like a beacon in the murky water. It's almost no surprise that he was the one that the predator finally got a lock on. Poor Frederich was doomed the moment he set foot in the water. Frederich turned back to face the open sea, getting ready to dive headfirst in to catch some speed to swim out even farther, when the beast reared out of the dark. Frederich stumbled back, but it was too late, and the shark was too close. It grabbed him by both of his legs and lifted the man clear out of the water. It was like an explosion. One moment all was well, and the next there was absolute chaos when the animal and man burst out of the water, scattering the crowd instantly. Flecks of red and blue showered the people as they ran and shoved each other out of the way. The sudden uproar of stamping feet, splashes, and panicked screams were so deafening that it drowned out Frederick's own screams of fear and pain. The upsurge of chaos was so bewildering that the shark's jaws slacked for just a moment. That was all Frederich needed to rip himself free. Pushing with his hands against the animal's snout, he could feel the razor-sharp teeth tear through his skin as he pulled himself loose. In the instant that Frederich was free, he turned and began to run on his torn and shredded legs, but his limbs just couldn't hold him up after the beating that they just took. Frederich went down before he even took 2 steps in the direction of the retreating crowd. The beast was on him again. Horrified, Margit and the crowd saw Frederich pull back to throw a punch. He would have hit the approaching 2-meter-long monster square in the nose, but almost like it had been anticipating this very reaction, the shark opened his mouth just as Frederick's fist shot forward. His arm sank into the deep and dark gullet right up to his shoulder. And yes, the shark bit down, taking the entire right arm clean off the socket. Lifting his only remaining arm, Frederich attempted one last time to land a punch, but with legs that didn't work and a spewing hole where his right arm used to be, he simply sank beneath the surface with a final spray of blood that was swallowed by the water. Huddled on the sands, the crowd huddled in terror, no one daring to go into the vicious splashing that was happening just yards from them. Helpless, they were forced to watch as the shark fed on Frederich right in front of their eyes. Margit, hysterical, attempted to run into the surf, but 2 South African teenagers stopped her from running to her death. She struggled so fiercely that one of the boys, a 19-year-old, had to push her into the sand and sit on top of her to keep her out of the water. He begged for her to stop, while the other boy grabbed her hand, promising to stay with her. The terrible scene went on for another 15 minutes before the waters finally became still and there were no longer any signs of violent splashing. And only then did emergency services arrive. But their only job now was to fish what was left of Frederich out of the water and to get the traumatized Margit to the hospital. That young boy held onto her hand until the ambulance doors closed and he was left standing on the beach, watching the ambulance drive away. Another vehicle took Frederick's remains away. Besides his right arm, Frederick's entire lower body was gone, and most of the organs in his abdomen had spilled out too. You'd think that such a gruesome death would mean the end of swimming at Port St. John's. But no, less than an hour later the surf was full of people again, none of them even aware of the terrible attack that had just happened in the very waters that they were swimming in. And even now, 14 years later, there are still no lifeguards or boats patrolling the waters, just a handful of signs that stand crooked and rusting in place to warn swimmers of the danger beneath the waves, until someone else is inevitably taken by the gray monsters that lurk beneath the surface and meets their own terrifying final affliction.